Hey guys, this is a response to a response. This is responding to, is it Pogobat, who responded to Venomfangx. Um, Basically, to Pogobat, I think that it's funny because I think your post is both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that it does actually attack his arguments in a logical sense. But then you also attacked his way of approaching the topic, which actually there's nothing wrong with it. I say there's nothing wrong with it in the sense that I can name you at least 300 or 400 philosophers who present their material in the same way, basically being arrogant and assuming that they're right. So it's not really an argument against him, it's just his style that has nothing to do with the argument and therefore doesn't really need to be commented on. Now, when it comes to his arguments, actually, I think all it does is actually reveal a problem with both theistic and atheistic arguments. Because now his argument about infinite time having to have a starting point doesn't really follow. Because if time is motion, then if there is a first moment of time, well, then there is t minus 1 and t minus 2 before that time, especially if you have an instance in which a God exists. Because if a God does exist, and most conceptions of God presume that he knows at least at least as much as we do. And since I can expect an event to happen in time, then you must assume that God can too. So if he creates the universe at 0, then he has to know it's going to happen at 0.1 minus 1 or 0 minus 2. Some would say, well, no, actually, time came into existence at the first moment. But once again, you have that problem, well, then this God didn't know it was going to happen. Or it could not actually experience the effect of the moment before it happened, which we can. That doesn't make sense. Then it seems that the theistic argument has the same problem that the atheistic argument does, is that if time is eternal, then this blip of whatever existence is supposed to be, because it's supposed to be like eternity, and then this little blip, and then eternity, well, then his own argument would defeat itself, being that if he's right, if God says that I will create the earth in an infinite amount of time, well, then wouldn't that follow, if we assume his argument is correct, wouldn't that follow then that the earth would never have been created? On the other hand, the atheistic problem is the same thing, in the sense that if the earth was created by the Big Bang or white hole theory, depending on what you follow, then basically you have a beginning point. But if you have a beginning point, then you must have a moment before the beginning point, and therefore time has to exist before time exists, and you still have the same problem. So basically, it comes down to either a God exists and the universe is eternal, and you have a problem with, well, God existing in eternity and eventually sometime creating Earth, and that doesn't make sense. Or the universe itself is like, if you ever seen K-Pax, it's kind of like a layman's term version of this, in the sense that if atheism is true, then the universe has to be eternal, there'd be an infinite amount of Big Bangs, and you still end up with the problem, well, why would the universe exist at all to begin with? Now, you'll have to excuse me, I'm just throwing these ideas out and I'm not actually explaining them, but I mean, this is a video blog, so whatever. But obviously there's also alternatives to this as well. For example, the universe could be eternal in the sense that it's always existed, infinite amount of Big Bangs, and a God could still exist. Because keep in mind here, we don't want to just assume like a Christian God or a Muslim God or whatever else. There are how many countless religions that exist on the earth, as well as every one of them could be wrong, and a God could still exist. Because obviously it depends on whether or not it's a personal God or blah blah blah. In counter to what some people think, that actually itself is not an argument against God or the existence of God, or rather it's just an argument against specific types of God. That if no religions are correct, then we can at least say that a personal God, in the sense of the religions say a personal God, would not exist. But there is almost an infinite amount of other types of possible gods that could exist, and so really that doesn't solve anything. Now, one way in which I do disagree with you is, I think it's like 136, you use an appeal to authority that many loyal, good Christians say this. That's not really a logical argument. I'm not sure if you know that. Secondly, being that conception of faith, well, what is faith? You have to define that. And also keep in mind that as well, I would also disagree with you and say that you're saying that you can never prove God exists or doesn't exist. That actually is not a logical statement. You want to say that as of this moment, you can't prove that God exists or can't not exist. And even that, I don't know if you can or not. Basically, all I can say is that I've never heard an argument that works. But the whole point of philosophy, and that's why I kind of am eerie against your post, and although I disagree with the Fang, whatever his name is, although I disagree with his arguments, I tend to veer towards him only in the sense that he is actually he's actually approaching the arguments, and although his arguments might be wrong, he's still approaching it. All philosophy is just approaching arguments, approaching ideas, and attempting to make solutions or attempting to find solutions. Whether or not you get it right or wrong, that's a different story. Whether or not philosophy has ever given any answers is itself a debatable question. Depending, I mean, I myself am a presuppositionalist, being that your starting point is a leap of faith, as you call it, is a jump in the dark, and all philosophy is basically a logical calculator, saying that based on your irrational starting point, where does that lead logically? Whether it's God exists or God doesn't, or I'm a chair, or whatever you want to think. But basically, being that if we want to say it right now, all we can say is that either like for example, you can even have hypothetically, let's say that there is an argument for the existence of God or the non-existence of God that works logically and is logical. It doesn't mean you're going to actually agree with it. It doesn't mean you're going to assume that it's correct. It could be correct, and you could be the wrong person that's wrong in not accepting it. Acceptance or non-acceptance of arguments have nothing to do with logic. It actually has more to do with passion, stubbornness, and people's own biases and ideas. If you look at the history of philosophy, or history of science, history of anything, you'll see that ideas don't really change so much because of the logical nature of an argument, but because of what is popular at the time, or what arguments are people more attuned to listening to, what is the social, economical, historical context of which is happening at the time. But I mean, that's enough rambling for me. This has lasted way too long. By the way, sorry, I sometimes speak too fast, and yeah, sorry.